They do. They do work. War games do work. The question is not why don't war games work? The question is why didn't those that the Pentagon played in preparation of the great and mighty war against Iraq work? And those are two completely different questions. Now, I don't have to tell you that any attempt to forecast the future is very, very problematic and very difficult. We really don't have a good way to handle the future. Suppose we do want to know what happens to the stock market tomorrow. Suppose we want to know where our country is going tomorrow. What possibilities do we have for looking into the future? Yes, we can use historical analogies. We can look back and say, in Roman times the situation was such and such, and therefore taking all kinds of things into account, then tomorrow things are going to work out in such and such a way again. Or we can use trends. We can say, a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, we were at points such and such. And since then, things have been moving in such and such a direction. And therefore, assuming that the trend persists, after tomorrow, we can expect to be at such and such a point. Or we can use the so-called Delphi method, which in essence means that we are going to ask various experts, Sir, Madam, can you please tell us what is going to happen tomorrow? I don't have to tell you that none of these methods is very reliable. Analogies are always problematic because circumstances are never the same. Trends have an unfortunate habit of coming to an end just when you need them most. And there's even a little limerick about that. A trend is a trend is a trend. The question is, will it bend or be pushed off course by an unforeseen force and come to a premature end? And finally, Delphi, Delphi sounds good, but is really very problematic because out of 50 experts, maybe one is going to get it right, and you never know which one. That reminds me of a former Minister of Finance that we used to have in Israel, and about him it used to be said that he was normal twice a week, but you never knew, 2 days a week, but you never knew which days. Ladies and gentlemen, forecasting the future is always very, very problematic. And we all know that. And if we only found a reliable way to do that, all of us here would presumably be millionaires long ago. War games are one method of doing this, or of trying to do this, and a method which has its advantages. In fact, war games have one advantage that no other method has. They allow you to do something no other means does. They allow you to play both sides of an issue. War, ladies and gentlemen, by definition, is a two-sided activity. Any war has two sides, two parties that interact with each other, that try to achieve their goals while at the same time preventing the other side from achieving his goals. Where you only have one side, you do not have war. You may have a massacre, but you do not have war. War, by definition, involves two sides. And here already you can see why war is so much like a game. Because most games also have two sides. And from that point of view, it does not really matter which kind of game you are talking about. Whether it is football or basketball or chess or many other kinds of board games, by definition they must have at least two sides, and usually most games, as we all know, do have two sides. So, from this point of view, there is a strong affinity between war and games. I could even argue that war is simply a game in which anything is permitted. And if you look back at the etymology of the word itself, war, and the way it is called in various languages, including my own, I'm Dutch originally. The Dutch way for a word, for a war is oorlog, which means the original game, or the great game. The great game, as some of you may know, was also the name that the British in India 100 or so years ago gave to the kind of minor hostilities which they were always engaging in against the Russians in Afghanistan. So war has this in common with games, that it has two sides. Both war and games involve strategy, which means that you are playing or fighting against an opponent who, like yourself, is to a large extent free to do or not to do what he wants in his attempt to achieve his goals and prevent you from achieving yours. So both wars and games involve studying the opponent in order to understand his mind. Both wars and games involve studying his capability to see not only what he wants to do, but what he can do. Both war and games will involve such thing as planning how to use your own strengths and exploit the other guy's weakness. And so on, and so on, and so on. I could go on and explain the affinities between war and games. And the beautiful thing about it is, again, that in many ways it does not really matter which kind of games we are talking about. You can certainly talk about the strategy of, let us say, a basketball game or a football game. And you can equally well talk about strategy in a war. And in both cases, it will be very much a question of trying to understand the other side, advantages and disadvantages, strong points and weak points, combine them with their own, and lock them together in such a way as to make the outcome work in your favor. So to return to my original point, I'm not saying that war games are perfect. I'm saying that in some ways war games are the best way we have as humans to study that great unknown which is called the future. And that this is particularly true in the case of war, precisely because of the affinity between war and games, and that affinity consists essentially of the fact that both war and games are two-sided activities. And so, if you look back into history, you will find that war games have always been used for planning, modeling, training, forecasting war. That indeed, in many ways, they have been the most used method for doing all this. Beginning, ladies and gentlemen, at least as early as we think the 10th century BC, when, I'm sure many of you know your Bible, according to the book of Samuel A, the Bible says, Surgent pueri et ludent contra nos. Let the boys stand up and play in front of us. The play involving 12 of the servants of King David and 12 of the servants of the house of Saul, who fought each other to the death until they were all killed. So using games to model war, using war games to understand war, using war games in order to substitute for war, in this case, goes back a very, very long time indeed. And one might even argue, perhaps, because we don't know, that the origins of war and games is exactly the same. I could give you any number of cases in which war games did succeed. Probably the best known example from the history of your own country are the hundreds and maybe thousands of war games that were played by the US Navy at the Naval War College between 1920 and 1941 in preparation for what was known at that time Plan Orange, a possible war against Japan. Some of you may even have seen pictures of how it was done. They had this huge hall, and in the hall it was surrounded by galleries, so senior officers could look on. The hall had a checkered floor, and on the checkered floor there were little models of ships. And for 2 decades, a whole generation of naval officers, some of whom were destined to rise to very senior rank indeed, played and replayed and replayed and replayed every single possibility that might one day arise in the war in the Pacific. And when the war finally came, there had been nothing that had not been replayed by somebody at some time during the preceding 20 years. You might say nobody really foresaw Pearl Harbor. That is true. But everybody had fought, quote unquote, the Japanese countless times and considered, which is what people should do in war games. Suppose the Japs do this, what do I do then? Suppose they do that, what do I do then? All of this with the help of little ship models that were pushed over the checkered floor with, as I said, galleries all around the hall so that senior officers could stand there and look on what was going on. I'd like to say something about the various kinds of war games. So maybe you gain a little bit of a better understanding of what this is all about. I just explained how the Navy used to do it, the US Navy. And many of you to this day, I'm sure, are aware of a whole class, a range of war games that are commercially sold and which operate exactly on this principle. They come in cardboard boxes. They are made by companies such as Avalon. They contain a map which is divided not into squares but into hectares. They have all kinds of counters that will represent ships or aircraft or tanks or units. And those can be moved according to very complicated rules to the right and to the left at such and such a pace in the presence of such and such enemy, quote-unquote, units, which will do to them such and such as they come close or as they don't come close, and so on, and so on, and so on. Usually these games are enormously complicated to play. They can take weeks, even months, until you finally finish with them. You have them at every level, from a model of the whole of World War II to the individual battle, and there are quite a number of people who play them. But this is only one of a great many types. Some of the earliest war games known were played by a Greek soldier and statesman called Philopoemen in the 3rd century BC. And if you read your Polybius, you'll find that Philopoemen used to go riding with his staff, and then he would ask them, okay, gentlemen, there's the enemy, he's coming from that hill, what do you do now? And then they had to make up their mind very quickly, what are they going to do now? They were not just finished, we would say, ha, you're mistaken, now he's coming, some others are coming at us from the other side too, what do you do now? Okay? Wonderful exercise. It may not be able to forecast what is actually going to happen, but it is the best possible training, and indeed I would say almost the only kind of training for an activity so full of surprises as war always is. As all of you know, the Middle Ages had their tournaments. What were tournaments if not war games? If not attempts to recreate war on a specified field at a specified time at a specified place. And originally they were extremely dangerous. The first known tournaments started around 1000 AD, and they got so dangerous that it became necessary to really create some rules so that not too many people would be killed. So they decided that they would only be played with blunt weapons. And they decided later on that there would be a partition. All of you must have seen this in the movies, separating the two opponents so that each one was moving, riding his horse on a separate side of the partition. But even so, accidents continued to happen. And in 1561, a king of France, Henry II, was killed in the tournament. And of course, later, the poor guy who did it was executed. You can't expect, you can't kill a king, even accidentally, and expect to live. There is chess. Many of you, I'm sure, know how to play chess. Chess originated in India in the 6th century AD. I won't go into all the details, but all of us understand that it is an attempt to model war. It is an attempt to model war which leaves out many things. First of all, it completely leaves out the little question of supply. So in that sense, it is a purely tactical game. It includes only the fight itself. And of course, even the fight is only included in a highly simplified way. And it ignores everything that happens until the forces clash on the battlefield. It ignores secrecy. One of the great differences between chess and real war is that in real war, very often you don't know what the enemy is doing. In chess you do. Experts call this a game of perfect information. In this particular point of view, chess is very different from war. Both sides are instantly and fully appraised of everything that the opponent does or does not do. Chess, like most games, although not all, also leaves out friction. Meaning that if I, as a chess player, want my queen or my castle or my whatever to advance from A to B, then this castle will in fact get the order to move from A to B, and it will get there. It will not be held up by rain. It will not be held up by, let us say, mud. The van will be there on time, right? To use my own example from today. All the little things, right? That, to use a somewhat crude term, all the screw-ups that are present in war are not present in chess. It is a game without friction. You can introduce friction into war games, but it is not easy to do. Usually, they do it by rolling a dice, okay? You decide to do something, and then you roll a dice. And let us say it is an ordinary dice with six surfaces. So you say that, or the rules say that in 4 out of 6 cases, the thing that you have decided to do is going to happen. But in one, it is not going to happen, and in one, something completely different is going to happen. Okay? So this actually is a good way to introduce friction into war. but as you can imagine, it makes playing the game very complicated, which is why they take so long, and which is why, personally, I must admit, I find them extremely boring. The attempt to incorporate all these factors into games will make them enormously complex. Some of those rule books will consist of dozens and dozens of pages with hundreds and hundreds of rules, and I personally must say I've never really understood, had the patience to go through them all, and never really understood how other people have the patience to go through them all, but that is their business. This is where computers come in. Computers have the advantage that you can feed any number of rules into them. And once you fed the rule into the computer program, it stays there. And the computer will not forget the rule, and it will not get the rule wrong, at least supposedly it won't, and it will do what it is told, and it will do what it is told very fast. So playing the game will not take weeks or months. Plus, it will do that time after time after time after time. So you can change the variables. You can feed in one kind of unit, another kind of unit. You can try this, you can try that. You can change the rules. You can do all that and play the game fast, time after time after time after time. And then see what works and what does not work. Ladies and gentlemen, I was supposed to tell you why war games don't work. And I have spent the last 20 minutes or so explaining to you why they do work. I don't want to take this too far. I don't want to argue that war games are perfect. No human attempt to look into the future is or can be. We are just little blind creatures with a very, very limited ability to look into the future. But as the tools, and God knows that they're not very good, but as the tools for looking into the future, for trying to, so to speak, to rehearse the future, for trying to explore, if not what the future will bring, what it may bring, and do so in a way that is not one-sided, but two-sided. I would argue, in spite of my talk's title, that there simply is no substitute for war games. War games are the tool, maybe certainly the best tool, maybe even almost the only tool for doing all of this. So the real question, ladies and gentlemen, is not why war games don't work. The real question is why those that were used in order to prepare for Iraq did not work. And those are very different questions. The first, and by far the most important reason, is because apparently there was no thought at all what would happen once Iraq had been occupied and Saddam Hussein toppled. You see, ladies and gentlemen, modeling Iraq was not so, or the Iraqi war was really not so very difficult. You had to have a map fed into the computer. You had to have the various forces fed into the computer. You had to have the capabilities, the things that I could do, the things that I could not do, fed into computers. All of this involves lots and lots of programming work, but it still can be done. We know more or less what such and such a weapon is capable of. We know more or less what such a unit and such a unit needs per day. We know more or less so many things that go into their moves and their fights and their shooting into each other, at each other. And you can feed these things into a computer, and then time after time you come out with the result, which actually happened, that this war would be won, and easily won too. So if it had all been about the first 3 weeks of the war, then you could have argued the war games worked, and they worked very well indeed. The problem, of course, was that contrary to President Bush announcing on board of the Lincoln and in the midst of that little party that he arranged for himself, major combat operations were over. Well, this was where he got it wrong. And this is where Rumsfeld got it wrong. And this is where Wolfowitz got it wrong. And I read, like most of you did today, I suppose, that Wolfowitz is now going to the World Bank. Do you know who went to the World Bank before him? McNamara, that's it. So, right? So I was wondering whether the same story is repeating itself. Let me tell you a little story about Wolfowitz. I met Wolfowitz some years ago at the World Economic Forum. And this was not long after the Russians had tried to occupy Chechnya and had failed miserably back, I think, in 1996. And so Wolfowitz and I were on the same panel and talking about why they had failed. And Wolfowitz, in all seriousness, was trying to explain that it was because the Russians had not used the best weapons at their disposal. The implication, of course, being that if they had been Americans, and if they had used every one of those marvelous weapons that America has, and which it models in war games, then of course they would have won easily. Well, they did win easily, but that was not the end of the story. That was only the beginning. And as we now know, over 90% of all the Americans killed in Iraq were killed after the end of major combat operations. And this still goes on. They were killed in a period and in a kind of operation, in a kind of war, that was never modeled at all. So whatever else, you can't really blame war games, can't you? You can't blame war games because this kind of thing was never modeled at all. It was simply ignored. There was no thought devoted to the question, what shall we do after we win, quote unquote, this war. And indeed, about a year ago, I think, I met a former head of Philips, the Netherlands, who told he was retired, and he told me, well, you know, not long after war, major war combat operations came to an end, suddenly I get a call from Wolfowitz, and Wolfowitz says, oh God, you know, we haven't made some thought about all of this, we don't know what to do. Can you please help us to set up a proper Arabic-speaking television station? Because we don't know what to do. Of course they didn't know what to do. They never gained it. It was never considered a problem. Why didn't they game it? They didn't game it because A, as I just said, because it was not considered a problem, but B, because it would have been extraordinarily complicated and difficult to do. You see, forming a model of a war with all the thousands upon thousands of factors that go into it is difficult enough. So difficult that in those hexes, games that are based on hexes, the rules are almost impossible to play, and so difficult that the computerized war gaming center at Rhode Island, the Naval War College, last time I asked about it, it cost $250 million to set up. But far more difficult is factoring in a whole country. Because now that the Iraqi army no longer exists, the United States is at war with a whole country, including not just military units that have so and so many tanks, and each tank can fire so and so many times a minute to such and such a range, and have such and such a kill probability, and it can move to such and such a distance over such and such terrain, and it needs such and such, so and so much supplies to do so, and so on and so on and so on. All of this is difficult to model, but you can still do it. But now you are talking about completely different things. You are talking about political relationships. You are talking about cultural relationships. You are talking about social relationships. You are talking about people's beliefs, people's thoughts. How do you factor those into a machine that basically only knows how to say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, so fast, you know, that not a million mathematicians can't cope with it? How do you feed beliefs, attitudes, thoughts into a machine? And the answer is you don't. And since you don't, you only play those parts of the war where hardware and its performance is decisive. And so, not only was the war that came after the end of major combat operations never gained, the reason why it was not gained, or maybe the reason why it couldn't be gained, was because there is no way to factor these other questions into a war game. Maybe I should tell you another little story about this. The other day I got a new book to review. It was written to somebody who teaches at one of your war colleges, but I won't name the guy. And he tried, as so many others have done before him, to construct a model of past wars to see whether it would work in the future. And it was a very nice model, except that it had absolutely nothing to say about morale, except that it had absolutely nothing to say about the will to fight, except that it had nothing to say, in this case, about logistics, nothing to say about cultural attitudes, and so on and so on. In fact, it had nothing to say about anything important. And unfortunately, I had to say so in my review. In the case of Iraq too, war games were applied. Some could say they were applied very successfully, but to the wrong war. They were only applied to the first stage, which was supposed to end, and which did end, with the complete defeat of Saddam Hussein's forces. After that, as the Russians say, yuk, nothing. Okay? A black hole. A black hole, both because they did not really expect any hard problems at this stage, and because the factors that go into fighting a war of this kind would have been probably impossible to model and therefore feed into the computers in the first place. And so, instead of playing what would happen, they played what they could model. And having played what they could model, they then decided that what they could model was the important thing, and that anything else did not require any particular thought. We all know the result. We all know the result. I myself would argue, and like most of you, I've noticed American casualties have been going down over the last few weeks, and of course I'm very happy about that, as I'm sure you are. That this is not because things are going well in Iraq. This is because things are going so badly in Iraq that whether what the US forces do or don't do, whether they are there or not, has become almost irrelevant. Apparently, there was an argument between bin Laden, somewhere in his cave in Pakistan, and Zarqawi, moving from one place to another in Iraq, and always somehow eluding his would-be captors, as to the best strategy to use. Bin Laden, being an ideologue, said, well, you have to go after those wicked Americans. After all, the purpose of the whole exercise is, as bin Laden wrote 10 years ago, to get rid of the infidels who are contaminating sacred Muslim land. Said Zarqawi, who is less of an ideologue and more of a pragmatist, and who is also the man on the spot, and therefore the man who holds the cards. Sorry, Mr. Bin Laden, Osama, my dear, I don't agree with that strategy at all. Without the Iraqi forces, the American forces in Iraq are deaf and blind. They, to use an impolite expression, don't know their face from their ass. And how can they, given that the number of Arabic speakers, people who are familiar with the culture, its tradition, its language, its habits, is so very slow, and where any translator is automatically a suspect, either because he wants to betray them or because he has pressure being put on him and he has no choice. And in a situation where American troops only stay in the country for a year, and so by the time they are really going to learn something, they are already on their way out. I say, thank heaven I don't have to serve in that place again. So, in a way, American troops are simply irrelevant. And since they are irrelevant, there's no point in going after them, the more so because, after all, they have the heavy weapons and they present more difficult targets. What we have to do is to go after the Iraqis, after the new Iraqi army. Indeed, since sooner or later the Americans are going to leave, in a sense, the war has already been won, and what we are doing now is not so much fight the Americans as prepare for the day after. And as I said, since it is Zarqawi and not Bin Laden who is the man on the spot, Bin Laden did not have much choice but to listen to him. Modeling all this would probably have been impossible. There is no game in the world that can factor in such questions. But, and here I've come to the end of my presentation, don't let that mislead you, as maybe the people who formulated the question for me to answer to some extent did. War games are one very powerful tool for looking into the future. In some ways, the best tool we have, and particularly for looking into the future of war. Because, as I tried to explain, no other human activity provides this a substitute for the one-on-one, two-sided interaction between two belligerents, each of which is trying to achieve his aims while preventing the other from doing the same, each of which is strategizing, each of which is trying to mislead the other, to outwit the other. There just is no substitute. The question is, how do we use these tools effectively? And what are the limits beyond which those tools cannot go? And I'm very much afraid that it is in getting the answers to those questions wrong that the Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Wolfowitz screwed up. Thank you for your attention. Sure.
We have a few minutes for questions.
It's a funny feeling, you know, coming all the way from Israel just for 40 minutes of talk. So please, I do my best to answer any questions.
Mark?
What's your opinion about letters of marque as an effective means of, let's say, finding bin Laden, because nothing else seems to work?
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done so already. I understand there is a $25 million prize on the head, and it does not seem to work either.
Issuing letters of marque as opposed to...
But practically you've already done that, right? Anybody who brings in information about bin Laden, dead or alive, you know, will be given $25 million. So it does not seem to work very well either, does it?
What I was going at to ask private people going out and doing it.
Look, I would not be surprised if private people are doing it already. Because 25 million is a lot of dollars, is a lot of money. Okay?
Question here?
In the context of your country, how effective have war games been for Israeli military preparation?
We have suffered from exactly the same problems as you do. We are probably today the second most sophisticated military on earth in some ways. We too use war games. We too have the Weizmann Institute. We too have computers. We too try to use computers in order to model our future wars, and the results are exactly the same. You can model, let us say, the effectiveness, or in my view, ineffectiveness of anti-ballistic missiles. Okay? You cannot model the factors such as the Palestinian willingness to commit suicide. Okay? How do you model that? And as a result, unfortunately, we have lost our struggle against the Second Intifada, and we are even now preparing to move out of the Gaza Strip. So I would argue we are suffering from exactly the same problems that you do, for exactly the same reasons. We are using the same tools to a large extent, and the results are also the same.
Walter?
Do you see any parallels between what you're saying and economics? Because it occurs to me that the neoclassicists or mainstream economists live or die by models, whereas the Austrians are much more suspicious of it. So it seems that, in a sense, your views are compatible with the Austrians, and the views you're criticizing with the neoclassicists. Do you see parallels there?
Well, tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say that too much of modern economics is based on the assumption that people are rational players. And I would not know whether that is more or less true for Austrian economics than for any other kind. But I would certainly argue that people are not only, and perhaps not even mainly, rational players, and therefore that economics forecast and economic gaming does get the things wrong as often as war games do. I would go one step further. If there is one activity in which irrational factors play a large role, which makes wargaming very, very difficult, it is war. Because you see, in a way, war itself is irrational. No rational consideration in the world can make you lie down your life. The very fact that you are prepared to lie down your life already shows that you are irrational. Right? What kind of rationale can justify me going to the grave? What kind of interest will I have left after I go to the grave, or after I'm blown up to such a way that there is not even a grave to be found for me? I'd say that if economic behavior, and I don't know enough really to distinguish with the Austrian schools and others here, but if economic behavior is often irrational, war is even more so. War is an irrational activity par excellence, which is precisely why it is so difficult to model, and why it is so difficult to game, and why by putting things like rates of fire and probability of hits and ability to move over such and such terrain and the number of targets that you can engage in so and so many minutes and so on and so on, number of units you need for that mission or that mission, which all of it you can do. You are going to leave out precisely the most important factors of all, which are the irrational ones.
Is there a question here?
Do you feel that there
scope or coverage of war games for defensive scenarios or as between defensive and offensive scenarios?
I doubt it. I don't see, frankly, why there should be. I would not draw the line between defensive and offensive. I would draw the line between factors that are, let us call them, material, and which can therefore be modeled, and factors which are immaterial and which can therefore not be modeled. How much, to give you a famous example, because these things have, I didn't invent them, they've been discussed time and time in the literature. How much was the knowledge that they were being commanded by Napoleon worth to the French army? Okay? How do you answer a question like that? Actually, I know at least one war game where they did try to answer it. How did they do it? Well, they searched, everything that anybody had ever said about Napoleon, and they came, I think, it was a saying, I think, by the Prussian commander Blücher, right, saying that Napoleon's presence was 40,000 soldiers. So they put 40,000 soldiers in addition, right? And I can hear you laughing. Rightly so, right? They added 40,000 soldiers to the French order of battle. And I agree with you, it's ridiculous, okay? But clearly the question is relevant and important, okay? But how do you answer it? How do you give a sensible answer that you can quantify and then put into whatever kind of word game you can use, right? And the answer is you cannot do it. And of course, in chess, for instance, they don't even try it. This is one thing that chess never even tries to do, okay? It never tries to model a question is, will the pawns fight harder and be more prepared to fight, to sacrifice themselves because the end of the game is approaching and the king or the queen are in danger, okay? No way, and perhaps you should say about those who created chess that they were sensible enough not even to try to include such questions.
You talked about how they tend to only wargame the part where the hardware, the material factors are decisive. Does that mean that the war-making state is going to prefer to deal with other states, if you follow me, and it's going to, because it doesn't know what to do when it faces, non-states?
Well, I would certainly say that modeling non-state wars is much more complicated. Okay, it's much more complicated because you are not talking about little soldiers, each in his uniform, each with so and so many weapons, such and such weapons, so and so many ammunition, requiring so many supplies, and able to do such and such thing in such and such a time, and so on and so on. You are dealing with a much more complex totality, and such a totality is very much more harder to model, which of course also works the other way around, and it causes planners to focus their attention on those things that they can model. Okay, so there is a vicious cycle here, and how vicious it is, we have unfortunately learned from the war in Iraq. I hope I'll be wrong, okay? I hope everything turns right. But I must say, I myself have been very, very foolish on this, and not that it matters much. Who cares about the professor from Jerusalem? But anyhow, in my view, this war was so foolish and so unnecessary that for months and months I could not believe that President Bush really meant it. I thought he was bluffing, okay? It was only 2 or 3 or 4 months before the war that I said, oh God, he really means it. How is that possible?
This question over here.
Back to Iraq. You mentioned that the prospects for the ultimate withdrawal of the United States caused Zarqawi to change his tactics and focus on really some war within Iraq. Don't you think there's some prospect for hope in that, and that if the United States is seen as irrelevant, there might be some internal resolution, might include Zarqawi, might not, but that's a better path than what appears than we could be on from U.S. intervention?
Well, unfortunately, the United States, like other states, has one goal, and that goal is to maximize its power. And I know that here in this room there are many people who are opposed to that, who think that it's a bad thing, that the United States would do well to well, maybe not completely withdraw from the world, but minimize its military interventions abroad. And here I agree with you. Maybe the fact that the United States in Iraq has clearly stepped on a big, sharp sword will help restrain the people in the White House, at least for a time. That is probably all you can hope for, right? Because in 20 years, again, they'll forget. But, 20 years is also something. And they'll resume the eternal drive for greater and greater power. But some people would certainly see it that way. That regardless of the outcome, this is an adventure that should not be repeated soon. And the way I read the polls, at least, lots of American people are seeing it exactly that way.
There's a question down here in front.
Would you consider that the war games were not really looking at how many tanks, but from a strategic point of view of hitting Iraq, not because of mass destruction, but putting a foothold to push for democracy in the area? Democracy being because these countries, with the tremendous wealth of oil, are generating or can generate terrorism. Would you consider that that was a war game? Not tanks, political strategy.
Well, the way it would have been, it's very difficult, as I've been trying to say, to put politics into a game. Okay? And certainly the kind of computerized game that I like running in the Pentagon. If you want to war game these things, then you'd better have some people sitting around the table, maybe with a partition between them so there won't be perfect information, and maybe with some kind of mechanism to make sure that the messages that they pass to each other are distorted on the way because of to represent cultural differences. Okay? So probably if you wanted to do it, to play a political war game, I would use very different ways, means, and I would not use computers at all. But then of course some people would say, oh God, we got this marvelous war gaming center at Rhode Island, it cost us $250 million and now we're not using it. How can we how can we do that? So if you wanted to do it that way, you would have to do it completely differently. Now, I would argue, and I'm not a great expert on this, I must confess, but I'm not sure I believe in the possibility of Arab democracy. And the reason for that is precisely the kind of factors that were never included in the war games played in the Pentagon because they didn't know they existed. You see, Arab society is very different from yours or from ours. And you may not like it, but there's no point in saying, bad Arabs. Point is to understand it. These are families, Arab society is made up of families that are constructed on very different principles from ours. First of all, unlike in this country, the family connection lasts a lifetime. In this country, basically, once children go to college or leave the home, they are on their own. Not in the Arab world. They are always stay together. Okay? Second, their primary relationship is not between parents and children, but which actually is quite weak, but between brothers, not sisters, brothers. Okay? And there is a very good reason for this. Because you see, until recently, these were societies with no state, only tribes, and no regular police force. And so the only way to defend yourself was to rely on your brother. If somebody stabbed you, your brother would come after you and stab him. Okay? So the primary bond is between brothers. Okay? They are the ones who are responsible for defending each other. To cement that bond, they marry each other. The way to do it is cross-cousin marriage. In our society, as you know, marrying a first cousin is very, very exceptional and something that you only rarely hear of. Although I'm not sure in this country, I think it's not actually prohibited. Our family is exogamous. Their family is endogamous. They marry each other. Cross-cousin marriage, which means that the daughters of brother A will marry the sons of brother B and vice versa. And as I said, these relationships don't last just for 18 years, they last throughout life. So you get a society that is not made up of individuals as Western society is. Okay? It is made up of clans. And people just don't have the free, least of all women, by the way, right, who in a way are very downtrodden, and in another way, because it is, the family is endogamous, they are the cement that holds the whole thing together. Okay? They are the cords in the net. They just don't vote as individuals. The idea of one man and one woman, one vote is completely foreign. Whole tribes hold together. Okay? Whole tribes will go to the polls together. And this is very obvious even in my own country, where a village near my own, is called Abu Ghosh, not far from Jerusalem, is divided into a number of tribes, clans really, because it's too small for tribes. So on election day, the whole clan will vote as a single person. If you know a little Roman history, the Roman popular assemblies function on a very similar system. And so I am not sure that democracy can be introduced into the Muslim world as long as this family system persists. And it is certainly, or it may change one day, okay? And I know, I'm sorry for taking some time, but I suspect this is not very familiar to you, and I hope you find it interesting. It may change someday. Some people will say that it is already changing. It is changing in the sense that that fertility per woman is going down. Women are going to school. Women are learning to read and write. The more they read and write, the less fertile they are. The less fertile they are, the more they go to school. Okay? So that even in the Arab world, the end of the system is in sight. May or may not be true. One thing of critical wisdom: it will not, the end of the system will not be hastened by precision-guided bombs. That is the wrong way to go about it.
Walter?
Better import Starbucks, I suppose.
I'm trying to extrapolate from what you said, and if I hear you correctly, what you said is when the U.S. fought the Iraqi state, they beat quickly. When they fought the Iraqi people were winning, or at least the U.S. isn't beating them. Similar with Israel, if I can extrapolate, when
Sure.
Israel fought Egypt or Syria,
Yeah.
beat them quickly. When they fight the Palestinians, who are not a state, they don't win. In your other work, you talked about the demise of the state. One of the arguments against anarcho-capitalism,
Against?
one of the arguments against anarcho-capitalism or free
Yeah.
market capitalism,
Yeah.
anarchism, is that if a country goes that way, it will be helpless. Other states will take it over. But what I hear from you, again, if I can extrapolate, is that this is not true. Namely, that the country that gets rid of its state then becomes more powerful, not less powerful.
Yeah.
So if you would comment and see if I'm on the same wavelength as you.
Yeah, I would argue that if there is a lesson, let us say, to the last 80 years or so of history, it is that conquering another people is usually not a very good idea. Okay? It's not a very good idea because, well, the idea of human equality was born somewhere in the 17th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, it led first to the Euro Revolution, then to the French one, then it spread all over the world. Now, even the last the last caveman in New Guinea has heard that all men are equal. And conquering another country, subjugating another country, the term itself, subjugating, sounds quaint, doesn't it, and old-fashioned, is not a good idea. And people who have tried to do that during the last, let us say, 80 years or so, I won't say entirely, but almost always have failed, even when they did things which were much worse than anything that you or unfortunately we have been doing in the territories. Don't forget, I know you're seeing terrible things on television, but if you look at the Second Intifada, which started about 4.5 years ago, in that whole Second Intifada, maybe 5,000-6,000 Palestinians lost their lives. I'm not sure, but something in that order. So we're talking about a little more than 1,000 per year, 3 per day. You know, it is not as if this is genocide. But even people like the Nazis, okay, who were not very nice, and who had the SS and had the Gestapo and had this and had that, and were prepared to do anything, even they found in World War II that taking over another people like the Yugoslavs was not a good idea. And I would say, and here I think you and I disagree, almost regardless of the economic system. Well, because capitalism, communism, tribalism, right? If you, in this time and age, if you try to occupy another people, then you are going to be in trouble. Anyhow, who could occupy the United States? Okay, it was a young congressman who said in 1838, and I quote verbatim, okay, "Without permission for us, nobody can drink a single drop of water from the Great Lakes or set foot on the Blue Mountains." And you know who that was? Well, I know many people here hate him. His name was Abraham Lincoln.
Question?
Me?
Yes.
You think that if we repealed the Dick Act, it would be going back to the same kind of concept that during the Spanish-American War, where several U.S. governors decided to take the troops out of the Philippines when they said they didn't want to occupy the country anymore?
What is the Dick Act?
Congress passed the Dick Act because two of the governors, as I remember, said that they're going to take the equivalent National Guard, the state militias, out of the Philippines because they said we're occupying force, and that's what and state troops were not allowed. So Congress immediately passed the Dick Act so they could prevent the governors from moving the troops. If the Dick Act was repealed, the National Guard then would be back under the jurisdiction of the governors, and if the governors felt to remove troops, they could do that.
Well, I'm not sure about the details. I'm sure you know United States history better than I do. But you know, some of you must be familiar with this publication called Parameters, which is published by the Army War College. And I just got my copy of the latest issue, and lo and behold, there was an article exactly about that subject, about the great success of the United States in putting down the Philippine insurrection, and of course the implication being that we are going to do it again in Iraq. What they forgot to add was that already in 1908 they were offering the Filipinos, putting the Filipinos on the road to self-government. In other words, if I had been prepared to offer the Palestinians self-government 20 years ago, there would never have been an intifada. So I don't think that this is a very good example. I would argue that limiting our view to the last 80 years or so, and here the gentleman over here, and I differ to some extent, it is very hard to find a case of successful occupation that lasted for very long, that did not end in more or less complete war. But, and here is where we differ, I don't think it has much to do with the socio-economic structure.
The question here?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question apropos of your comments on why the Iraqis cannot achieve democracy. democracy are incompatible is a more difficult argument to make. I think just the opposite. I mean, it may have been the case for a long time that Swiss democracy depended very much on Berber families coming together. The essence of Athenian democracy, as they understood it, was sun oikasus, it was the coming together of households. And one can argue that self-government becomes weaker where families become more precarious. That there must be something else about Iraqi society that explains why you have thugs running the place. Thugocracy is not necessarily the result of strong family ties. I think that there are probably other factors, other critical factors, which have to be taken into account.
No, that's perfectly all right. I would argue that they're not the same kind of family, okay? That we have a very specific kind of family here, which functioned in the way that I tried to explain, and which prevents people from thinking of each other as of themselves, as individuals, and make them regard the clan or the tribe as the most basic unit, and therefore means that the idea of one man, one vote is foreign to them. They are going to vote in blocks and not in individual societies. Now, it may even have been true for some societies, including the Swiss one in the remote past, but you know, Swiss democracy with the system of one person, one vote did not develop in one day either. And actually, since we're talking about Switzerland, originally, as I'm sure you know, the Swiss assemblies were, until 1976, the Swiss women did not have the vote. And the reason for that was because originally these were assemblies of armed men. Okay? It was not a question of people going to the polls and casting their votes. It was a question of people presenting themselves with their weapons, okay, in order to debate the questions. Okay, since women did not fight, did not carry weapons, obviously they were excluded from the assemblies. So you might argue that the development of Swiss democracy, in a different way, of course, as far as women, the relationship in men and women are concerned, and the participation of women, in a way illustrates how, in a different way, how certain kinds of family relationships can affect democracy, and have continued to do that until 29 years ago. Okay, but of course, it's a different kind of family. And we shall have to wait to see whether indeed, as some people believe, after God knows how many millennia, these kind of ties are now changing. Arab families are becoming more like our families. The bonds of brotherhood are being broken by the presence of a police force, so that so that it is no longer necessary that one brother rely on the other for protection and defense. That women are getting better educated, and as they get better educated, they have fewer children. Endogamous marriage comes to an end. We shall have to see. As I said, it may happen, but certainly not by bombing them with precision-guided weapons.
Last questions back here in the back. No, Chief.
There are examples of states being able to subjugate people in recent history. The North subjugating the South at the end of the Civil War, and the Chinese in Tibet recently. What makes some obviously these are exceptional cases. What makes these cases work? Why are some states able to achieve this in some circumstances versus the situation now with us in Iraq, where or with Germany in World War II, why they haven't been able to succeed and have this and being able to conquer this people, not only as a state level, but also by conquest of the people?
That is a very good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. And if I had a very good PhD student, maybe I would set him to look for an answer. But let me explain. you are perfectly right. Those huge empires, I'm not sure whether you should include the Civil War, but those huge European empires that used to dominate the entire earth until not so very long ago could never have been set up, could never have been established if, as one British officer once told me, looking down his nose, told me, we were very good at a smacking business. Okay? Obviously, neither the British Empire, nor the French, nor the Portuguese, nor the Dutch, nor and so on, could have been established if those people had not been very good at the smacking business. And I would argue that this lasted until about 1920. Between 1920 and 1939, they still won most of the conflicts in question, but it was no longer that easy. Okay? Take my own country. Israel is a very small country, even if you add the occupied territories. It's only about, how many? 7,000 square miles, 8,000 square miles, okay? The British were confronting what they called between 1936 and 1939 the Arab Revolt. In the end, after 3 years, they were able to put it down, but only after they promised virtually everything. They promised an end to Jewish immigration. They promised an end to Jewish land purchase outside a very restricted part of the country, and they promised, I quote, evolution towards independence in 10 years. This is just one example. Between the wars, it was becoming more difficult, and in this case, the Brits had to, well, they won in a sense, but only at the price of surrendering everything, or promising to surrender everything. After 1941, and I select that date, the German invasion of Yugoslavia, okay? That, to my mind, is the real turning point. And I choose that case deliberately, precisely because the Nazis were completely useless. There was nothing they needed to do. At one point, they and their allies had 29 divisions in Yugoslavia. They killed almost 1 million Yugoslavs, which was more than 10% of the population. Still didn't help them. Okay? Since then, yes, there have been some cases, but they become very rare. I won't say none at all, but very rare. Clearly, there has been a shift. And it is with the consequences of this shift that you are now dealing in Iraq, and we are dealing vainly, I must say, in the territories. I must say that I have no good explanation as to why the shift took place. I suspect it has to do something with the fact that beginning already with the Nazis, modern armies no longer move on foot. Okay? The Wehrmacht did as well against Yugoslavia as you did against Iraq. It took only 2 weeks to occupy the country, which was only a little smaller than Iraq. It is very difficult, the country is very difficult topographically, okay? They took very few casualties, and they did quite as well. Because at that time, as you know, they were the most modern army with the tanks and the aircraft and so on and so on. But like you, once it was over, within a matter of weeks, it became clear that those same famous Panzer divisions and the same Stukas were almost useless against the new kind of war then developing. So I would suspect it actually has to do something with the nature of modern war, with the kind of weapons that is being used in modern war, which do not so much occupy countries as carve them into pieces, leaving anything that is far away from the roads almost untouched. Because even if the tanks can go everywhere, the supplies cannot. But I have never explored this in depth, and as I said, I would dearly like to have a good PhD student who could write a good book about it. Thank you.
Thank you.